Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Nancy French. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. You may have noticed I am not Curtis Chang, who is the actual host of this podcast, but I'm in his seat this week because he's away for this month, and I'm thankful to be joined by David French. Now, Curtis calls David the founding friend of the Good Faith Podcast because they started this before David went to the New York Times. But I just call David my husband. So welcome, David, to the Good Faith Podcast.
Hey, Nance. I've never been a part of a podcast that you've hosted before, but we've been together on many podcasts before. So this will be fun.
I know this is fun. The last time I hosted, I was hosting Curtis, which was a little like having to do a project in front of your teacher.
Yeah.
This is fun. So welcome. And so you've got both Frenches today. And David and I, as you may have heard before, we love our TV. And so recently we watched a television series that we wanted to talk to you about today. And it was the documentary called Shiny Happy People. It's something you may have seen. It's on Amazon Prime. It's centered on the Duggar family and the teachings of a guy named Bill Gothard. Now, the Duggars, as you probably know, were on a reality TV show called 19 Kids and Counting, and there were a lot of spinoffs. But their spiritual mentor, this Bill Gothard, is less famous. Most people in the secular world, at least, have never heard of him, but he's far more consequential, obviously, than this reality TV phenomenon. And you may have seen this, or definitely you've heard people talking about it, because this has been a blockbuster for Amazon Prime. It is had the biggest debut of any documentary series ever produced by Amazon Studios. It reached more viewers in the first 9 days than any Amazon docuseries. David, tell us a little about what this show is about.
Yeah. So this was a documentary, as you said, about the Duggar family, but really about the combination of the Duggar family and the Gothard teachings. And doesn't surprise me at all that it was a hit because the Duggar series was a hit. I mean, this is something that went on for years. You had 19 Kids and Counting, as you said, Nance. Then you had Counting On after the scandal emerged about Josh Duggar and molesting his sisters. The show was canceled, but they then followed some of the older sisters for several years. So that didn't surprise me. The Duggars were popular. And then the story is lurid and to people who are not deeply ensconced in evangelical Christianity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, strange. So the very thing, kind of the strangeness of the Duggar family, the 19 children, hardly typical, helped draw an audience, but you add kind of that strangeness of the Duggar family to the strangeness of the Gothard teachings, and you're going to kind of get an audience that it's sort of like rubbernecking at a crash site at an interstate. Like, whoa, let's check out this really strange thing and phenomenon and weird collapse of the Duggar reality TV empire. And so there's a lot of reasons why people would be drawn to it, just from kind of the, I don't want to say prurient interest, but sort of that rubbernecking phenomenon. But it's a lot deeper than that. It was very well done, first of all. And so I think the reason why it resonated is because people tuned in out of curiosity and then found it really deeply impactful and shared about it with friends and told family members about it. I saw people discussing it at length on Twitter, for example. And that's why I tuned in. There's a lot of documentaries that have been written and done lately. There was a documentary about Jerry Falwell Jr. and Liberty University, which I watched and was gross. It was gross. I think I shared with you segments of it, Nancy, that were just unbelievable. Some of the audio tapes, for example. There was a documentary about Hillsong also at the same time, but none of them caught on like this one caught on. And I think the reason is, and we'll talk about this, is you mentioned earlier about Gothard, and that a lot of secular folks and also a lot of evangelicals might not know about him. I mean, the evangelical world is big, but he was huge in his subculture that he created. Huge. The estimate that you see from his Institute for Basic Life Principles is anywhere from 2.5 to 3 million people who went to his basic seminar. And if you think that's sort of a casual time commitment, no, it is not. The basic seminar was days of commitment. Then, he had multiple layers of commitment beyond that. This is a guy who reached an awful lot of people. And so that's why I tuned into it. I wanted to see, and we'll talk about this also. I had a brush with it, well, more than a brush with it in the 1990s. I had a close encounter with it all in the
Right.
1990s.
Yes. Well, I think David and I were sort of affected by this docuseries for two different reasons. The first and most interesting reason is David's. So many of you may not know that David was engaged to another woman before we met.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah, he was engaged and almost got married to a different person. He wrote about this in the New York Times in an article called Shiny Happy People, Fundamentalism and the Toxic Quest for Certainty. And I love the first line. Here's the first line. In the summer of 1993, I almost joined a cult for love. And David, this is your story, wasn't there, but I'll let you take it from here. Why did you almost join a cult?
Yeah, well, and to be clear, you did not break up the engagement. It was over before we started dating.
Yeah, but I would have, if I was there, I would have looked that up, seen what I was losing, and edged on in.
Yeah, so I was dating and then I was dating and got engaged to somebody that I met in college. I went to college at Lipscomb University, a Christian college in Nashville, much more conservative place then than it is now. But it's funny, like even then you had all the arguments and divisions in Christian colleges about who was too conservative and who was too liberal. And my school is called David Lipscomb, and its critics called it David Liberal. And it was one of the least liberal places on planet Earth. But anyway, we were dating, we got engaged, and I knew that they were involved in this thing called IBLP. And that they had gone to something called ATI. IBLP stood for Institute in Basic Life Principles. ATI stood for the Advanced Training Institute. And they weren't homeschooled, but they had become very curious about homeschooling, had been to these conferences. And so my fiance said, you need to go. We can't get married unless you go. Her father said, you need to go. You can't get married unless you go to this IBLP seminar. And so I went to it. It was about a full week in Louisville. I was living outside of Lexington, Kentucky at the time, and it was this summer break. And so I drove to Louisville every day for a week. Big, 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 big mega church in Louisville. And it was a packed house of families and young couples, a lot of young families. And we sat under Bill Gothard's teaching for a week. And it was wow. I mean, something else. You go into it where you're engaged to somebody and you're kind of told you have to do this for this engagement to work. So you're coming in primed for it to be to accept it. Like hey, I'm going to, we're going to be building a family together. She really, really, really values this teaching. I want to know about it. So you come in with your mind open. And wow. I think the best way to describe it would be a combination of legalism on steroids with a version of the prosperity gospel. So the legalism on steroids was there were rules upon rules upon rules upon rules that were all sort of designed to make sure that you had a godly family. I mean, just to give you an example, there were rules about music, and those rules about music held that if you're listening to music, there had to be the following hierarchy in the music: that melody had to be primary, harmony had to be secondary, and rhythm had to be tertiary. And that rock music, because it put rhythm forward first, was inherently sexualized. And therefore, there was no such thing as good rock music. Not even Christian rock music was good music. And so the music there was very hymn heavy, sung by big choirs, for example, with sort of classical music in the background, symphonic music in the background. And then you had other rules. You had rules around dressing, that girls in particular had to pay extremely close attention to the way that they dressed, and that the way that they dressed was designed not just to be modest. So modesty was presumed, but it had to be a very particular kind of modesty, one that couldn't even hint at any sexuality at all. And the hints at sexuality were called eye traps. So any like slit on a skirt was an eye trap, or anything, even if you were wearing clothing that covered you up to your neck, if the clothing was designed in such a way that it implied the existence of breasts, for example, that was an eye trap. And there was a huge emphasis on the role of the girl in male purity, that in essence, because men were deemed to be sort of inherently visual creatures, then modesty and chastity were absolutely indispensable. But with the emphasis on modesty and chastity really applied to women much more so than men. And then you had also, this sort of sense that if you followed these rules, here's the prosperity gospel element of it, that if you followed these rules, not only would your family be harmonious and peaceful, and not only would your children follow the Lord, that you would be successful and prosperous. Women, if you obeyed your husbands, if you sort of followed the hierarchy of authority, with Jesus providing an umbrella of protection over the family, the husband providing an umbrella of protection over the wife sort of managing the household, that if you followed all of that pattern, then the wife would be more beautiful. That this was actually a key to physical beauty, was obedience, and the term was countenance, and that your countenance would be radiant if you did this. And so it was very appealing to people because it purported to provide certainty. If you are in this deeply confusing, highly sexualized world that is hostile to Christian values, and you don't know how to raise your children in such a world, you don't know how to have a marriage in such a world, a godly marriage, this was the formula. This would do it. And if you did it, then all would be well with you. That's why, you called it a prosperity gospel. It was not a Pentecostal community, not a name it, claim it kind of community looking for miraculous signs and wonders. But there was absolutely the sense that if you were in these umbrellas of protection, prosperity, beauty, obedience, all of these things awaited. And if you were outside of them, then you were vulnerable to Satan, death, disease, destruction, shame, all of those things you were vulnerable to. And so it was both very authoritarian, but because of what it promised to families, was, at least initially, to an awful lot of people, very appealing.
Well, I did say that I enjoyed your first line of your article about how you almost joined a cult for love, but I did push back on that just a little, because I want you to talk about generally the vibe at this conference. Like, I think we use the word cult very liberally. And I think even more like sobering to me is the idea that maybe this wasn't a cult, that this was just a part of mainstream Christianity.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's scarier than like a Branch Davidian type thing, because everyone just accepts it. David, can you speak a little bit about what it was like, what you saw, what the vibe was generally?
Yeah, it's funny. I did actually wrestle with using the term cult there, because just for exactly the reason you articulated, that the word cult gives off a vibe where you imagine a bunch of people in robes kind of chanting weird things or living on compounds in rural Texas or Montana or something like that. when you would go to this and you were looking at lawyers, accountants, doctors, people who, insurance salesmen, people who, this was prosperous middle class, upper middle class America here. And these were not people in a million years that you would think, oh, this is a cult. These are cultists. It was people you went to church with. This was not a separate denomination that people joined. People were not leaving churches to join an IBLP church. They were staying in their churches. So a lot of elements of it, you would say cult just doesn't fit. That's just not right. And that's certainly not the sensation that you got when you went to what was called the basic seminar. But it is a word that began to apply the instant that you went deeper into the movement. So look at the IBLP as like the gateway drug. This is where you got the basic principles. But then if you really wanted to be dedicated within this world, and the Duggars definitely were, there was more. There was the Advanced Training Institute, which is where they would train their homeschool cohorts. There was a group called Alert, which, believe it or not, Nancy, was essentially, well, you believe it because you saw it on the documentary, but almost like a paramilitary organization.
Yeah, that
Where
was weird. That was a weird
that
part of
was,
the docuseries.
yeah, that got weird. That where young men are like doing push-ups, and it's like they're in front of a drill sergeant and they're running and they're doing all kinds of things that look like you're training a militia. Now, it was not a militia. It was sort of designed to be a program for young men to become strong in body and mind, but it looked very much like a paramilitary organization. And then you could go work at, quote, headquarters. And that's where things were even more sort of cult-like, where the young interns that would go and work at headquarters worked in unbelievable amounts of hours under unbelievable layers of authority. And that's where it also turned out that Bill Gothard had access to people who he alleged, or they alleged he abused, harassed, sexually harassed, and abused in other ways. And so really, when you were talking about IBLP, that was the surface, and then you got deeper into it, and it did get very, very cult-like. And so the surface exposure really was, you know, as amenable as hyper legalism can ever be. I mean, people were friendly. There was this real sense of camaraderie. There was this real sense of hope. Like, we figured this out. We've got this. We now know how to raise children in this world. We now know how to conduct our marriages in this world. So you had a lot of upbeat hope. But the deeper you got into it, the more you realized, wow, I mean, it's not just that the teaching is off, the culture here is really weirdly intense and off. And so I felt comfortable using that word because the instant you scratch deeper than the actual basic seminar, the more it took on all of the trappings of what you would consider to be a cult-like environment.
That's very interesting. Well, it was a great first line, and I, I need to take a break here, but stay tuned, and we'll find out what happened with David and this other woman. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back, and we're here with David French, and I'm Nancy French, and I am guest hosting the Good Faith podcast. And David was in the process of telling us about how he was engaged before we met, and his fiance was very into the Bill Gothard teachings. Obviously, because she's not here right now, this relationship did not work out. So, David, take it from there. How did you respond? So, you drove to Louisville from Nashville every day for a week, which, by the way, is an indication that you were all in with this person.
Louisville from Lexington. So,
okay.
yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, I was.
Okay. So, but you were all in, you proposed, y'all were going to get married, everything was going to be happily ever after. You went to this Bill Gothard training seminar, and how did you like it? Like, tell us more about how that actually manifested in your relationship. So if you were a Bill Gothard acolyte, how would you act as a fiance versus just a normal person?
Yeah. So the there was a rule essentially within Gothardism that's actually going to sound quite familiar to people who were in evangelicalism in the 90s and familiar with purity culture and um, with I Kiss Dating Goodbye, the Josh Harris book from many, many years ago. So in Gothard world, you didn't really date, you courted. And so what I would describe our relationship as is more of a courtship in Gothard lingo than a dating relationship in the classic way that you sort of think of in outside of that world. So very heavily parentally influenced. For example, if you had two Gothard families, so if you had a Gothard family with both the boy and the girl, often it could be a lot like arranged marriage. It would look a lot like arranged marriage. It wouldn't be specifically that, but it would sometimes come really, really close because it was all a very father directed enterprise. And so we kind of had a hybrid relationship, kind of quasi courting, quasi dating. And I was fine with all of that. But then when I saw the teachings, when I saw them up close and in depth, I couldn't get on board with it. I couldn't do it. It just, I guess the best word to describe is it just seemed Pharisaical. I wasn't familiar because I'd grown up in the Church of Christ. I had not been exposed to a whole lot of other denominations or other streams of Christian tradition because the Church of Christ was pretty insular and believed all other streams of Christian tradition were heretical. So I wasn't exposed to them that much. And so I wasn't familiar with the prosperity gospel. So I couldn't have a name for this thing that I was seeing, but I knew what it was. I knew that this was not, that scripture was not a kind of a formulaic, scripture did not teach a formulaic lifestyle that if you do this, then all of these things will happen to you. Now, there are blessings and curses that you see, especially in the Old Testament, but the New Testament is quite explicit and that, it's quite clear that when you're a Christian, you take up your cross. And you're not taking up your cross where God's sort of saying, well, if I signal your willingness, if you signal your willingness to take up your cross, well, here comes health and wealth and beauty. And no, no, that's not it at all. And so I would put it this way, Nancy, I would say when I knew I was not going to be a part of IBLP, it was the Titanic hit the iceberg. and
Right.
and I use that advisedly because the Titanic, if you've seen the movie, it sank slowly. but that ship was going down, and that's how I describe it. After that, we sank slowly, but the ship was definitely going down, and it was apparent to me pretty soon that relatively soon, that it couldn't be saved. And so, we did end our relationship. But, I when I look back at that, so it had all of this personal for me resonance, but it resonated with you, Nancy, I know, even without any experience with IBLP, and it resonated with you for reasons unrelated to me. In other words, beyond sort of a curious look at what I almost got involved with, there were
Yeah.
some aspects that really impacted you. So what could you walk through that a bit?
Yeah, well, my eyes were wide when I was watching this because I couldn't believe what I was watching. Number one, I guess now that we know your whole backstory, and listeners can know that I am very thankful for Bill Gothard because apparently our whole relationship, couldn't have happened if he hadn't been there, like agitating your relationship with your previous person. But so very thankful for this development. But the reason I was triggered by this documentary is I also was raised in the Church of Christ, which is, as David mentioned, very insular. Even we were reached by this sort of teaching. I was in church where they passed around a rose, and it was all girls, in those very special Sunday schools. And they'd pass around a rose and we would look at the rose, and they encouraged us to touch the petals and to smell it. And by the time it went around the whole class, at the end, the rose was looking sort of raggedy, and they held it up and they said, "You are this rose. If you are handled by men, you're going to look as raggedy as this." I mean, it was just like, it was very alarming, and also, as David has pointed out in his writings, antithetical to the gospel, that there is a certain type of sin, sexual sin, that is beyond God's forgiveness and mercy. So I just thought that was super interesting. I saw a lot of parallels just in my own life. But the thing that really got me is you guys know that I've been investigating Kanakuk camps in Branson, Missouri, the largest Christian camp, sports athletic camp. And I've been sort of ensconced in this world for about 3 years. I've done very little else other than investigating this camp. And so as I was watching this documentary, I just saw moment after moment after moment that tied back to the way that I saw Kanakuk operating, which was interesting because while I was investigating it, we had a call with Rachel Den Hollander. And she was very gracious with her time. I got on the phone with her, and the first thing out of her mouth basically was, "Are there any ties from Bill Gothard to Kanakuk?" And I said, "I don't think so. I don't know anything about it." And she goes, "I think they're there." She said it more adamantly than that. She goes, "There's definitely ties there." And so I did not realize until, as I was sitting there watching the docuseries with you, David, I did not realize what Rachel was talking about until I saw this docuseries. So there are a lot of similarities. And just to go over a few of them, Joe White, who's the CEO of Kanakuk Camps, wrote a book called Irresistible Love. And he said that the greatest journey of his life began in 1974 at a Bill Gothard conference in Tulsa. And so the story of the Kanakuk camps is that Joe White, the CEO of Kanakuk, sort of has been leading this camp for decades, and a lot of sexual abuse has happened there. There was one super predator named Pete Newman who abused, as a prosecutor estimated, hundreds of boys. Pete Newman is now in prison. But what I uncovered over my investigation, my 3 years of investigation, was that the camp was aware of a lot of very egregious, abusive, nude behavior that this Pete Newman, who was a director at Kanakuk Camps, had been doing for years. Parents complained. There was a camper who literally saw Pete Newman abusing someone. They alerted the camp. But they just continued to ignore this abuse. And they even promoted him. They kept moving him up the hierarchy of Kanakuk. He became the face of Kanakuk. Everybody loved this guy. So repeatedly, they ignored all of these red flags. So one of the things that jumped out at me was the fact that women are responsible for the male gaze and for male sexual misbehavior. And the reason why this jumped out at me is because through the course of my investigation, I got a hold of the deposition videos. And I got to see Joe White describe why he did not fire Pete Newman. And I want to play you this clip, David. This is from the actual deposition videos of Kanakuk Camp CEO Joe White being asked by an attorney, Linda Turley, why he did not fire Pete Newman. And let's play the clip.
Why didn't you fire Pete Newman or give him a job where he was not directly involved with youth?
Objection form. As I've tried to explain before, Mrs. Turley, would you give me permission to give you a slightly different word picture that may help you?
I would like for you to answer my question, so that would be fine.
Okay. If you could picture, and this one has helped me and others a lot understand why we took the course of action we did and didn't take a different course of action over the years. But if you could picture in your mind, if you could picture, say, an archery target, and you would see different circles of rings around the archery target, going from a yellow target in the middle bullseye to a red, to a blue, to a white with different values. Pete Newman, over the years that he worked with us, had his initial layer of accountability was his wife, who I am convinced, completely honest, completely forthright, astute, had no idea about Pete's actions. He was a married man.
So in this clip, Joe White says that the first layer of accountability was Pete Newman's wife.
Right.
How does that strike you?
Well, wild. I mean, obviously a person who is an abuser is going to be doing everything in their power to conceal this from their spouse. So number one, just as from a simple pragmatic point of view, the idea that the first line of defense is the very person that the abuser is most keen on deceiving, from a pragmatic point of view, is absurd. It's ridiculous. The other thing that struck me was that, look, how much the idea of being married was sort of deemed as the thing that cured sexual dysfunction in men. And so this was something that with Josh Duggar was a theme in the documentary, was this sort of hope that if he had a godly marriage, that would somehow kind of cure him from his dysfunction, his grotesque dysfunction. And this idea, again, that sort of male virtue is in women's hands, and that sort of the way a woman responds sexually or not to men really is kind of the fundamental driver of male virtue, is laden within the IBLP, was laden within that sort of Gothardism more broadly. But it's really important, Nancy, to highlight that this kind of notion didn't spawn completely from the mind of Bill Gothard. It wasn't confined to the mind of Bill Gothard. In many ways, what Bill Gothard was kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of evangelical ideas that were in circulation at the time. He kind of put them all together. This is not a guy who came up with all of everything that he taught. He pulled a lot of the strands together. And so this was something that was a part of the background purity culture in the 80s and 90s, was this real emphasis on women are responsible for male virtue. By dressing modestly, you're going to guard male chastity before marriage, after marriage, by sort of boundless sexual availability to the husband. You're going to keep the husband faithful during marriage. And by obedience to the husband, you're going to be beautiful so that the husband continues to be attracted to you and not to other women. And so you saw this real emphasis on the woman as safeguarding the virtue of the man. And you saw this not just in that deposition excerpt, but throughout the Kanakuk materials. There's this sense that, well, Pete Newman's got a problem, but once he gets married, then things should be better, or things should be okay. And it was a very eerie thing, because when it comes, especially when it comes to protecting children, you can't think of it as first line of defense, second line of defense, third line of defense. We're all the first line of defense,
Right.
especially when you're a camp and you actually have custody of the kids at that moment. You are the first line of defense. You don't delegate it to the guy's spouse. I mean, that was literally unbelievable. And by the way, when he was saying that, they had already had years of complaints about him being nude with kids, and he still says that the wife was the first line of defense. It was really a remarkable moment in that deposition.
Yes. And after Kanakuk received complaints about his nudity with the kids, I mean, this guy would play nude basketball, nude four-wheeling, nude swimming with children. After they received all these complaints, the camp established these temporary boundaries that they were going to become more lax after Pete Newman got married. And so I have this little behavioral correctional memo, and it says, this is in effect until you are married. After you are married, we will sit down and reevaluate, which is really interesting. It just, again, puts a responsibility to curtail a man's sexual desire on the woman.
And think about the implication here, Nance. Think about the implication. The implication is they're knowing that he has sexual inclinations towards kids that they think will possibly be directed elsewhere once he's married. I mean, is there any other reasonable interpretation of that? Because if the idea is we're imposing these limitations on you and your interaction with children until you have a wife who is going to receive the affection that you were, it's dark stuff. It's dark.
It's so dark. It's even darker than even we're indicating. That's why my eyes were so wide when I was glued to the screen during this docuseries. It feels like something that has infected various strands of Christianity. And I could see it most clearly in Kanakuk because I'm so familiar with it. There was another instance where Joe White had a private pilot, and that pilot, his name was Robert John Morgan, he was arrested. He confessed to sodomizing his own daughter. And Joe White, according to Robert John Morgan's wife, has encouraged them to stay married after the confession, which is just mind-blowing. But it shows this primacy, this value that they placed on marriage and staying married no matter what, beyond the biblical mandates. And so Joe White even gave his pilot housing at Kanakuk during the off season while the guy was waiting for his trial. And then Joe White testified in front of the judge and said that he didn't want this guy to be put in prison, that it'd be healthier for him to be rehabilitated outside the prison walls. And he said he'd trust this admitted rapist around my daughters, he said. Now, the judge wasn't affected by Joe White's testimony, and he sentenced Morgan to 10 years. And so that whole thing is over, but it's also not over for the victims. And it indicates a level of darkness and such a lax attitude towards sexual abuse and such a callousness towards the victims of the abuse, including the women who are in these men's wake. Also, there are tons of victims that are male, especially at Kanakuk, but it's just mind-blowing. So I wanted to bring that up because I was watching this docuseries. I was thinking about Rachel Denhollander in my head. I was hearing her words echo, and I could see it all a lot more clearly. So another thing about, sorry, David, I'm so overwhelmed by this, but also another thing about it is that in the documentary Shiny Happy People, one of the things that was so fascinating is that anyone who criticized this ideology, they were immediately labeled agents of Satan. They were saying, you're coming against all of these good people. How dare you be used in this demonic way? And that's also what happened at Kanakuk when there was finally a whistleblower named Toby Neugebauer, who was the first to demand that Newman face consequences for his abuse. Joe White, according to Neugebauer, said that he was doing the devil's bidding by asking for accountability. So anyway, I just feel like this purity culture stuff is a petri dish of abuse, and I've seen it up close for the past 3 years, and I just could not believe it. I'll put in the show notes some links to the articles about Kanakuk so you can find out more about that. But David, let's talk about why this is important. It feels like frequently we're always talking about bad things and what's wrong with the church and what's wrong with America. And I don't even know where the hope is in this. And even if this matters, like this is 1990s era Christianity, probably not our best decade. Um, so is this just some bad stuff from the past? Why are we talking about it? Why do we bring it up?
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of things. One is I think it's very important to understand that IBLP was not sort of like an infection contained in a cyst, Nancy, where it was.
Oh,
I know, sorry.
why?
I'm sorry.
Curtis leaves for a month and this happens.
It was not contained, it spread. And a lot of the ideas around Gothardism, a lot of people adopted them without even knowing that where they came from or what they were. And some of these ideas persist in Christianity today. And one of the reasons is exactly related to what I said earlier, which was it was not a separate church. So what you had was people who were members of congregations of your, a Southern Baptist church in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and a Christian church in Louisville, Kentucky, or, you name it, from a Nazarene church in California. They would come, some of their families would come to IBLP and come back out and bring these ideas to their church. And this part is really important. And I didn't write about this because I was writing about a different part of this for the Times, but I didn't write about this, but it's very important. What was created, an impression was created in the 1980s and 1990s that if you were really, truly serious about your Christianity, this is what you would aim towards.
Right.
And why would this be an impression that if you are really, truly serious about your Christianity? Because in so many evangelical churches, there was a sort of a Gothard element. And a lot of these were the people who are sort of most apt to volunteer in church, who were most committed to the life of the church. And it sort of created this view that the deeper you got into the faith, the more like the Gothard world you became. And this is kind of a fruit of the poisonous tree. It's all of these different families and all of these different youth groups all over the United States. And so they have influence in their own institutions. They were not separate and they were not walled off. And so it created this expectation that if you were truly serious about your Christianity, these were some of the characteristics that you'd adopt. And so that's why you see echoes of this radiating out well past the time when Gothard was at his peak, and still continuing to this day. The second thing about it that's important has nothing to do with sort of American evangelical subculture and everything to do with human nature. And that is, not all of us are vulnerable to an appeal to certainty. And I think that this is a really important aspect of it, because you should not look at the people who attended those seminars as weird other people. It's one of the reasons why I was so transparent about it in the Times pages. I wanted readers who had got to know me a little bit over the last several months to know, hey, look, this reached far. I was, pulled into it for a bit, and I don't think I'm weird. I'm not that weird, but it was because we have a longing for certainty in an uncertain time, in an uncertain world. We want to know how to make our marriage a good marriage. We want to know how to raise children in a way that they're healthy and happy. These are some of the most desperate questions in our lives often. And people would come to the IBLP often in a state of vulnerability. Their marriage was suffering and they were told this is the way, or they were having difficulty with their teenager and they were told this is the way. And so we seek that certainty. And you can see that all over our culture, all over, where people out of desperation or curiosity will turn to gurus, to brands, to you name it, who are all offering much the same thing. Here is certainty. Here is how you fix things. And so many of us are vulnerable to this appeal, and this appeal takes different forms in different communities. And so, you'll see it in appeals to alternative medicine, for example, which often can seem as much like a lifestyle and a cult as a treatment regimen. You can see it in different forms of sort of different kinds of offshoots from mainstream Christianity. You can see it in different communities and different faiths. This appeal of fundamentalism and this appeal of certainty is very strong. And I think, and not all of us, some people are kind of drawn to the chaos, but in many of us, there's an appeal to certainty and stability. So when someone offers certainty and stability, it pricks something deep within us, that we have a craving for it. And so, one of the reasons why I wrote the piece in the Times was to kind of alert people to look. You can point and say, oh, look at those people over there. Oh, look how weird they are. And you don't reflect back on how are the ways that I've tried to achieve sort of this absolute certainty. And I've seen it in more secular spaces. I've seen it, for example, Nancy, around education. Here is how I raise brilliant children, to be sure. This is how I get them into the Ivy Leagues. Whatever is your priority for your kids, you are desperate for certainty about that priority. And it makes you vulnerable to cons at extreme ends. It makes you vulnerable to cults. It makes you vulnerable to bad ideas. And so, one of the themes of my writing and speaking is we have to learn to have a high degree of existential humility, and also have to learn to embrace a high degree of uncertainty, and to understand that that's inevitable. That's just a part of the human condition. And the Gothardism rejects that idea. It rejects the idea of uncertainty, but it's not the only movement to do so. And if you find yourself seeking that certainty, and I'm not talking about shunning like good advice or wise counsel, but this sort of formulaic certainty that we're vulnerable to, watch out.
David, what you said about certainty was very interesting to me. One of the reasons why I really was triggered by the documentary is, as I've written about in the Washington Post, I was abused in the church context by a vacation Bible school teacher when I was a kid. And after that happened, while the church was emphasizing that females are responsible for male sexual misbehavior. And so in my mind, I always felt responsible for this, even though I was like 12 years old and the person was a preacher. I felt responsible for that in a way that I couldn't untangle in my head. And so I think that desire for certainty, it stems from a good place. We don't want our kids to be hurt. We don't want our kids to experience or be victimized by evil. And so we have all of these rules. And so people take comfort in these sort of artificial rules, like, okay, well, dress this way, use this language, have all of these protocols, everything will be fine. And I'm not sure why they focus exclusively on the female behavior, trying to change that so that they can change.
I would say not exclusively, but predominantly, for sure.
Yeah. And so that sort of idea, one of the reasons why I think it's important to talk about is there are people like me walking around who had this sort of experience, and their whole lives they've been gaslit to indicate that they're responsible for a bunch of stuff they're not responsible for. And so I think it's important to talk about, for victims of sexual abuse, to sort of be validated, maybe for the first time in their lives. I talked, throughout my Kanakuk investigation, I talked to a bunch of people who were just now realizing that they had been victimized because they'd been told the wrong story their entire lives.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that I think is really, really important. Look, we're fallen, we're flawed, we do bad things. But what this taught people was that if bad things happen to you, in other words, you haven't done a bad thing has happened to you, then a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, the first response to it was, what did you do wrong?
Right.
Because if you were following this teaching then these calamities should not occur. These calamities were evidence that you are not following the teaching, because you're following the teaching, you're under all of the umbrellas of protection, right?
Right.
And so it's totally, in that kind of circumstance, it's totally understandable why somebody who is an actual victim of abuse would immediately start questioning themselves, because they were promised this wouldn't happen if they were obedient, right? And so they were obedient, but it happened anyway. They were doing everything their parents told them to do, and it happened anyway. They were in the church environment, and it happened anyway, or in the family environment like the Duggar sisters, and it happened anyway. And so what ends up happening? All of your training for your whole life says you must have done something,
Right.
because this doesn't happen when you're under the umbrella of protection. And so think about the burden. Like, just think about the burden for 5 seconds that puts on victims. It actually, as you were indicating, can make a victim feel like they're the victimizer. In other words, that they're the person that must have drawn or attracted the predator to them. It's extraordinarily dark, this worldview, this mindset. Because when you take it to its logical conclusions, that's what you're telling people. That's what you're telling kids who've been abused, maybe physically abused by parents. This kind of calamity would not befall me if I was doing what I was supposed to do. Why would I say that? Because that's what I've been told, that if I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, then I enjoy the umbrella of protection, or the hedge of protection around me. And if somebody's hurt or harmed, then there must be a chink in their armor. There must be a hole in the hedge. And whose fault is that, right? And so it really was this incredibly dark system that essentially took people, because perfection is not possible. What was being promised was not possible to deliver. It then put people at varying degrees. So on the one extreme is you have people who've actually abused, and teaches them that it's their fault, all the way to people who are just unhappy or sad or anxious. And all of that's their fault as well. It's always your fault, because if you were doing what you're supposed to be doing, then the protective system, and I compared it to like superstition. It's like baseball players who come up, and a lot of baseball players are very superstitious. They have these rituals that they'll do before every single at bat or before every single game. It's just, it's a placebo for a lot of people. It might calm their nerves or whatever, but for some, at some level, it's a superstition, right? If you do A, B, C, and D, then sort of magically, supernaturally, E, F, and G happen. And so there was this was a superstition laden movement. But again, if you bought into it, everything was your fault when things weren't good. And think about the burden that places, especially on people who've suffered at the hands of truly evil people. It's just absolutely stunning stuff. And look, I know that somebody might be listening to and say, no, there were other nuances, David. That's the message that was communicated. I mean, listen to some of the Duggar sisters when they're talking. They've been talking about their experience more openly. Listen to other people who came out of IBLP. Let's just say that a lot of the nuance got lost in the emphasis on obedience. The kind of qualifiers got lost and got washed away. And all of the emphasis was on obey and prosper, or obey and be protected. And if you weren't prospering and if you were vulnerable, then there had to be a problem with your obedience. And again, it's just hard to overstate how harmful that was.
Right. No, I hear you. I feel like, for the past few years, as I've been investigating sexual abuse in the context of church communities like Kanakuk camps and Branson, I've just encountered so many people who are sort of becoming awakened in this moment in the post Me Too era. And it's actually very beautiful. I'd love to have some hope in this conversation. And so the hope that I've seen is that after talking to so many hundreds of people, I have seen victims become awakened to this reality, that they were not responsible for their abuse, that there were people responsible, who, in my opinion, haven't quite been held accountable in many ways, but that they weren't. And so seeing sort of their this self-realization, seeing uh, maybe for the first time people re-engaging with their faith. A lot of people have left the faith, understandably, after being victimized in this context. But seeing people sort of awaken to this reality, and they're retelling the stories of their lives, because what happens is you get stuck in a false narrative, and it's very hard to overcome it. It's hard to change your perception of yourself to being someone who God loves, to being someone who is good. And a lot of times in church, there's so much focus on the depravity of man. I think it's sort of counter, it's not helpful, especially for victims of sexual abuse, because that's what we've been told our entire lives. But I've seen a lot of people change the stories, tell themselves the more accurate narrative, and start the healing process. And there's probably a lot of listeners out there who've been through similar situations, and they also are sort of coming to terms with what they were taught as a kid, and some of the Christian teachings that were directly against some of the gospel teachings. And so that's one good thing that comes from the Shiny Happy People documentary. What else? What else is good about this, David?
Well, I think, anything that clears away the cobweb of lies is good, that gets in the way of the actual gospel. One of the things that I have seen for people who've grown up in this kind of hyper legalistic environments, whether they're Gothard or not Gothard, because nobody you were around was talking about IBLP in the Church of Christ in the 70s and 80s in West Tennessee. Church of Christ, as I said, was very insular. There were ideas that kind of leaked into it, but at the same time, it was an extremely legalistic environment that you were growing up in. And to encounter the actual gospel after that is to encounter good news. It's really good news by contrast to what you experience if you grow up in like the IBLP environment or other fundamentalist environments. And so, one of the positives of this sort of quote unquote deconstructing movement is that a lot of people are untangling themselves from a lot of falsehoods, but that's only half the journey, right? It's untangling yourself from falsehoods and then embracing truth. And what is the truth? The truth is a lot of good news about who Jesus is. The truth
Right.
is good news about grace. The truth is good news about redemption. The truth is good news about what the fruit of the Spirit actually is. That all of that is good news. And so, as much as painful as it is to sort of have your eyes open to falsehoods, especially if those are falsehoods that created real harm, it's often that necessary first precondition to understanding the good news. And we had a pastor, Nancy, who used to say, you can't understand how good the good news is until you understand how bad the bad news is.
Right.
And
I feel like I have had a PhD in the bad news. But one of the things that listeners may not know is that when I was struggling and I had rejected Christianity and I wore black fingernail polish and smoked clove cigarettes and sat on the edge of my Christian campus, sort of being a malcontent, that's when I met you. And David is the one who told me about the gospel for the first time. We were sitting in my apartment in Green Hills in Nashville, and you just told me about the gospel. You presented it to me. We talked about C.S. Lewis. And right there in Green Hills in my apartment, I encountered God in a way that I'd never encountered in my life. What I was rejecting was a lot of this false gospel. Behavioral modification is probably the best way to put it. And I remember talking to you, and you presented the gospel in such a way that was so beautiful and so alluring. I didn't even, I'd never encountered anything like it. I loved the way that you said Jesus. I love, like, I'd gotten so sick of religious people. I'd gotten so sick of Christians. Anytime they would talk to me about faith, I sort of recoiled. I sort of had this hard carapace about me spiritually. And then I met you, and you told me about the gospel, and I believed. And that was what, 27 years ago?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. So it's been a crazy ride. But in a lot of ways, that was the beginning of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this has been a great conversation, David. I really appreciate you joining the Good Faith podcast to talk about this very important topic. I wanted to end with Philippians 4. A lot of times people are critical of conversations like this, and they say, they quote Philippians 4, which is, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And this has become sort of like a clobber verse for people like me who are always uncovering maybe some of the dark underbelly of Christian practices, is that we need to focus more on positivity. But I wanted to read that because I think it's actually very beautiful, because in that list, the first criteria, the first adjective is true. So whatever is true, think about these things. And I think if you ever have a conflict between something that is true and something that is not praiseworthy, or something that is true, something that is not excellent, the priority should be focusing on the truth. Jesus is the truth with a capital T, and he's not afraid of all of the complexities that we bring to him. And so for everybody who's been in sort of these, been enmeshed in sort of these strange Christian worlds, or churches or communities that force inappropriate, unbiblical teachings on them, this is a cultural moment where we can stop, pause, reflect on what we've been taught, and reject the stuff that does not correlate with biblical teaching. And there's joy there. There's truth. There's joy. There's a possibility to have healing. And it's very beautiful. And I'm very thankful for the Shiny Happy People documentary for sort of uncovering this, for lifting up the rock, and for the whistleblowers who were willing to tell the truth. I appreciate their courage. And I hope that everyone who saw that documentary, who reflects about how it's affected their own lives, can not come away from this embittered, but rather invigorated that the truth of the gospel is so much more powerful than the falsehood of all of that fake teaching.
Well said, Nance. Very well said.
All right. Thanks for joining us at the Good Faith Podcast. Stay tuned, and we'll be back next week.